The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of courtroom 7A, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches. Judge Michael Brennan adjusted his black robes with practiced precision, his movements deliberate and measured after 15 years on the bench. The day's docket appeared routine, a series of minor infractions and traffic violations that hardly seemed worthy of his Harvard law expertise. At precisely 9:30 a.m., Sarah Washington entered the courtroom, her presence immediately commanding attention. Her charcoal gray suit, purchased from her first major bonus at Johnson & Associates, represented more than just professional attire. It was her armor in a world that often judged her before she spoke a word. Her natural hair was styled impeccably, every detail of her appearance calculated to command respect in a profession that hadn't always welcomed people who looked like her. The bailiff called her client's case, docket number 2024, CT 1635, State versus Marcus Thompson, charged with failure to yield at an intersection. Sarah approached the podium with the quiet confidence that had earned her a rising reputation among her peers. Her client, a nervous college student working 2 jobs to pay for his education, stood beside her. Judge Brennan peered down from his bench, his steel-gray eyes scanning the documentation with an air of dismissiveness that Sarah had encountered far too often in her career. "Counselor, how does your client plead?" His tone carried the weight of authority and something else, a subtle condescension that made Sarah's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "Not guilty, Your Honor," Sarah responded, her voice clear and steady. "If it pleases the court, I have evidence demonstrating that the intersection in question has a documented history of obscured signage. Furthermore, the city's own maintenance records show." "Ms. Washington," Judge Brennan interrupted, emphasizing her title with a slight pause that felt deliberately belittling, "this court's time is valuable. A simple traffic violation hardly warrants such elaborate argumentation." Sarah stood her ground, maintaining her professional composure. "Your Honor, my client's clean driving record and the circumstances of this incident merit consideration. The photographic evidence I've submitted clearly shows." "That will be enough," Judge Brennan cut in again, his voice carrying a finality that echoed through the now silent courtroom. The other attorneys present exchanged knowing glances. They had witnessed this dynamic before, though few dared to challenge it. As Sarah attempted to continue her defense, Judge Brennan's patience visibly thinned. His fingers drummed against his desk, a habit his colleagues knew signaled mounting irritation. "Ms. Washington, this court finds your client guilty of the charged offense. Given your insistence on belaboring this simple matter, the fine will be $750, triple the standard amount. Let this serve as a reminder that this court's time is precious." Sarah's hand tightened around her leather portfolio, her knuckles whitening slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Note my exception for the record, Your Honor." She turned to her client, whose face had fallen at the mention of the fine, an amount that would mean skipping meals for the next month. As Sarah gathered her documents, Judge Brennan was already calling the next case, dismissing her presence as if she were invisible. She walked back to her seat, her heels clicking purposefully against the marble floor, holding her head high despite the sting of the interaction. Little did Judge Brennan know that their paths would cross again, very soon, under circumstances that would force him to see her in a very different light. As Sarah exited the courtroom, she pulled out her phone to check her afternoon schedule, a meeting with the prestigious Brennan family about their mother's estate planning. A slight smile played across her lips as she walked toward the elevator, knowing that sometimes justice took unexpected turns. Judge Michael Brennan settled into his leather armchair that evening, savoring the quiet of his Victorian-style home after a long day on the bench. The familiar comfort of his study, with its wall-to-wall legal volumes and the lingering scent of aged wood, typically brought him peace. Tonight, however, that tranquility would prove short-lived. His phone illuminated with his sister Catherine's name, an unusual occurrence at this hour. "Michael, we need to talk about Mother," she began, her voice carrying an urgency that made him sit upright. Her doctors are concerned about her cognitive decline. We need to get her estate in order while she can still make decisions. The judge's grip tightened on his crystal tumbler of mineral water. Their mother, Eleanor Brennan, had been showing signs of memory loss, but he had been reluctant to acknowledge the severity. The Brennan family's matriarch had always seemed invincible, managing their substantial family wealth with the same precision she had used to raise her 3 children after their father's passing. "I've already taken the initiative," Catherine continued, her tone carrying the authority that came from being the eldest sibling. Johnson and Associates came highly recommended. Their estate planning attorney is brilliant. She just handled the Richardson family's estate, you know, the banking dynasty. Judge Brennan allowed himself a small smile, appreciating his sister's thoroughness. "Who did they assign to our case?" "Sarah Washington," Catherine replied enthusiastically. "She's relatively young, but her reputation is exceptional. Harvard Law, top of her class, and she has this wonderful way of explaining complex legal matters. Mother absolutely loved her during the initial consultation." The crystal tumbler slipped from his hand, landing with a dull thud on the carpeted floor. Sarah Washington, the same attorney he had dismissed and fined excessively mere hours ago. The universe, it seemed, had a perverse sense of humor. "Michael, are you there?" Catherine's voice cut through his stunned silence. "Yes," he managed, his throat suddenly dry. "Catherine, perhaps we should consider other firms. I know several reputable." "Absolutely not," his sister interrupted firmly. "Mother's already signed the retainer, and Ms. Washington has begun the preliminary work. The family meeting is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. You'll be there, of course." The judge closed his eyes, remembering the look of controlled dignity on Sarah Washington's face as he had dismissed her arguments that morning. Now this same attorney would be handling their mother's $50 million estate, including the charitable foundation that bore their father's name. "Of course I'll be there," he replied, professionalism masking his discomfort. "Send me the details." After ending the call, Judge Brennan poured himself another glass of water, his hand slightly unsteady. The day's events played through his mind. His dismissive tone, the excessive fine, the way he had cut her off repeatedly. Each memory now carried new weight, knowing she would soon hold significant influence over his family's legacy. He walked to his desk, opening his laptop to search for Sarah Washington's professional profile. The screen illuminated with her accomplishments: executive editor of Harvard Law Review, multiple publications on estate tax law, youngest partner in Johnson and Associates history. His earlier treatment of her seemed even more egregious in light of her credentials. Tomorrow would require all his judicial composure. As he prepared for bed, Judge Brennan wondered if Sarah Washington was at that moment reviewing the morning's courtroom transcript, perhaps preparing to show his family exactly who would be managing their mother's estate. The thought followed him into uneasy dreams, where the scales of justice swung wildly out of balance. Judge Michael Brennan settled into his leather armchair that evening, savoring the quiet of his Victorian-style home after a long day on the bench. The familiar comfort of his study, with its wall-to-wall legal volumes and the lingering scent of aged wood, typically brought him peace. Tonight, however, that tranquility would prove short-lived. His phone illuminated with his sister Catherine's name, an unusual occurrence at this hour. "Michael, we need to talk about Mother," she began, her voice carrying an urgency that made him sit upright. "Her doctors are concerned about her cognitive decline. We need to get her estate in order while she can still make decisions." The judge's grip tightened on his crystal tumbler of mineral water. Their mother, Eleanor Brennan, had been showing signs of memory loss, but he had been reluctant to acknowledge the severity. The Brennan family's matriarch had always seemed invincible, managing their substantial family wealth with the same precision she had used to raise her 3 children after their father's passing. "I've already taken the initiative," Catherine continued, her tone carrying the authority that came from being the eldest sibling. Johnson and Associates came highly recommended. Their estate planning attorney is brilliant. She just handled the Richardson family's estate, you know, the banking dynasty. Judge Brennan allowed himself a small smile, appreciating his sister's thoroughness. Who did they assign to our case? Sarah Washington. Catherine replied enthusiastically. She's relatively young, but her reputation is exceptional. Harvard Law, top of her class, and she has this wonderful way of explaining complex legal matters. Mother absolutely loved her during the initial consultation. The crystal tumbler slipped from his hand, landing with a dull thud on the carpeted floor. Sarah Washington, the same attorney he had dismissed and fined excessively mere hours ago. The universe, it seemed, had a perverse sense of humor. Michael, are you there? Catherine's voice cut through his stunned silence. Yes, he managed, his throat suddenly dry. Catherine, perhaps we should consider other firms. I know several reputable. Absolutely not, his sister interrupted firmly. Mother's already signed the retainer, and Ms. Washington has begun the preliminary work. The family meeting is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. You'll be there, of course. The judge closed his eyes, remembering the look of controlled dignity on Sarah Washington's face as he had dismissed her arguments that morning. Now this same attorney would be handling their mother's $50 million estate, including the charitable foundation that bore their father's name. Of course I'll be there, he replied, professionalism masking his discomfort. Send me the details. After ending the call, Judge Brennan poured himself another glass of water, his hand slightly unsteady. The day's events played through his mind. His dismissive tone, the excessive fine, the way he had cut her off repeatedly. Each memory now carried new weight, knowing she would soon hold significant influence over his family's legacy. He walked to his desk, opening his laptop to search for Sarah Washington's professional profile. The screen illuminated with her accomplishments: executive editor of Harvard Law Review, multiple publications on estate tax law, youngest partner in Johnson and Associates history. His earlier treatment of her seemed even more egregious in light of her credentials. Tomorrow would require all his judicial composure. As he prepared for bed, Judge Brennan wondered if Sarah Washington was at that moment reviewing the morning's courtroom transcript, perhaps preparing to show his family exactly who would be managing their mother's estate. The thought followed him into uneasy dreams, where the scales of justice swung wildly out of balance. Judge Michael Brennan's chambers had always been his sanctuary, a place where the weight of justice felt manageable beneath the watchful gaze of his predecessor's portraits. Tonight, however, the familiar space offered no comfort as he reviewed the day's court recordings, his father's stern portrait seeming to judge him from its gilded frame. The electronic hum of his computer filled the silence as he repeatedly played the footage of Sarah Washington's appearance in his courtroom. Each replay revealed nuances he had missed or chosen to ignore during the morning session. The measured patience in her voice, the impeccable legal citations, the compelling evidence that he had dismissed without proper consideration. Next case, his recorded voice commanded through the speakers, cutting off her well-reasoned argument. He paused the playback, the harsh fluorescent lights suddenly feeling too bright against the dark wood paneling of his chambers. Pulling up his case history database, Judge Brennan began a systematic review of his recent rulings. The patterns emerged slowly but undeniably: harsher fines for minorities, less patience with their legal arguments, subtle differences in how he addressed attorneys of different backgrounds. The evidence of his bias, laid bare in cold statistics, made his Harvard Law degree on the wall feel like a mockery of justice. His phone buzzed. Another message from Catherine about mother's estate planning. "Sarah is brilliant," the text read. "Thank goodness we found her before mother's condition worsens." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. The very attorney he had dismissed as incompetent now held the keys to his family's legacy. Rising from his leather chair, Judge Brennan approached the window overlooking the courthouse steps. The evening crowd had thinned, but he noticed a young black attorney helping her elderly client down the stairs. The scene triggered a memory. His father, the previous Judge Brennan, making a casual remark about those people in their profession. He had inherited more than just his father's title and chambers. The weight of this realization drew him back to his desk, where he began pulling records from his earlier years on the bench. Each folder revealed similar patterns, thousands of small injustices accumulated over 15 years of presiding. How many careers had he impacted? How many lives had been made harder by his unacknowledged prejudices? His computer chimed with a calendar reminder. Estate planning meeting. Sarah, Washington. Thursday, 2:00 p.m. The upcoming one-on-one consultation loomed like an impending sentence. She would be prepared, professional, and probably aware of exactly how many times he had ruled against minority defendants and attorneys. Judge Brennan reached for his judicial notebook, the same one where he recorded his thoughts on complex cases. Tonight, he began a different kind of entry. Review needed. Potential systemic bias in rulings. His pen moved across the page with judicial precision, outlining steps for a comprehensive audit of his past decisions. As night settled over the courthouse, the judge remained at his desk, surrounded by case files and statistics. The portrait of his father watched as he methodically documented his findings, each page revealing the invisible framework of privilege that had shaped his judicial perspective. The last light of day faded from his chambers as Judge Brennan confronted the uncomfortable truth. His bias hadn't just affected Sarah, Washington. It had undermined the very principles of justice he had sworn to uphold. Thursday's meeting would require more than just professional courtesy. It would demand a complete reassessment of everything he thought he knew about fairness, equality, and his role in the justice system. The Brennan family's second meeting commenced in Johnson & Associates' premium conference suite, where Sarah Washington commanded attention with a sophisticated presentation on advanced estate planning strategies. The afternoon sun cast a golden glow across her digital slides, each highlighting complex tax avoidance methods and trust structuring options. The Qualified Personal Residence Trust, Sarah explained, her voice carrying the perfect blend of authority and accessibility, would allow Mrs. Brennan to transfer her Hampton estate to the children while minimizing gift tax implications. Her fingers moved gracefully across her iPad, bringing up a detailed analysis that even James Brennan, known for his skepticism, found himself nodding along to. Judge Brennan observed from his seat, noting how Sarah handled each family member's concerns with remarkable insight. When Catherine raised questions about the charitable foundation structure, Sarah produced a comprehensive comparison of various options, complete with projected tax benefits and potential regulatory challenges. "This is precisely why the Richardson family recommended you," Eleanor Brennan commented, her eyes bright with approval. "You've considered angles we hadn't even thought to question." Sarah acknowledged the compliment with practiced grace, but her next words carried subtle weight. "In my experience, Mrs. Brennan, justice is in the details." Her eyes flickered briefly toward the judge, who shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The presentation continued as Sarah outlined a sophisticated strategy for protecting the family's generational wealth. She navigated through complex IRS regulations with the same ease that Judge Brennan had once dismissed in his courtroom. Each meticulously prepared document reflected hours of research and analysis, demonstrating a level of expertise that made his previous treatment of her seem increasingly shameful. James Brennan, the family's most demanding member, leaned forward with interest. "These offshore trust structures, they're completely legal." "Absolutely," Sarah responded, producing a folder of relevant case law. The Second Circuit upheld similar arrangements in Thompson v. Commissioner. "I've prepared a detailed brief on the precedents." The judge recognized several cases he himself had studied, presented with a clarity that surpassed his own understanding. As the meeting progressed, Sarah deftly handled questions about medical directives, successor trustees, and power of attorney designations. Her responses revealed not just legal knowledge, but a deep understanding of family dynamics. She anticipated potential conflicts and proposed elegant solutions before tensions could arise. "The spendthrift provision," she explained, addressing a particularly delicate point about James's teenage son, provides protection while maintaining flexibility for educational expenses. The solution elegantly addressed Eleanor's concerns about her grandson's recent extravagant behaviors without causing family friction. Judge Brennan watched as Sarah pulled up a three-dimensional chart showing the proposed trust structure. The complexity of the diagram highlighted the sophistication of her strategy, making his earlier courtroom dismissal of her legal arguments seem increasingly indefensible. "This is remarkable work, Ms. Washington," Catherine said as the meeting concluded. "I can see why you made partners so young." Sarah began gathering her materials with practiced efficiency. "Thank you. I believe every client deserves this level of attention to detail, regardless of the size of their estate." Her emphasis on every client carried a weight that Judge Brennan couldn't ignore. As the family filed out, discussing Sarah's proposals with evident approval, Judge Brennan lingered behind. He watched as she organized her notes with the same precision she had shown in his courtroom, a professionalism he had failed to acknowledge. The realization settled heavily. Sarah Washington wasn't just good at her job. She was exceptional, and his prejudice had nearly cost his family her expertise. The annual State Bar Association Gala transformed the Grand Meridian Hotel's ballroom into a sea of designer evening wear and polite conversation. Sarah Washington moved through the crowd with practiced ease, her deep blue evening gown catching the light from crystal chandeliers overhead. Her presence at these events had evolved from novelty to necessity, the rare black woman partner whose success made her both an attraction and an anomaly. Judge Brennan observed her from across the room, noting how effortlessly she navigated between different social circles. Here she was discussing recent tax legislation with a senior partner from a rival firm. There she was charming a retired judge with her knowledge of his most cited opinions. Each interaction demonstrated a mastery of professional politics that he had previously failed to recognize. "Sarah's quite remarkable, isn't she?" Catherine appeared beside her brother, champagne flute in hand. "The Richardson family is already recommending her to their entire social circle. Apparently, she saved them millions in estate taxes." The judge nodded, watching as Sarah expertly deflected an obviously intoxicated senior partner's inappropriate attempt at familiarity. Her smile remained professional, but he noticed the slight tension in her shoulders, a burden of maintaining composure he had never had to consider. Later in the evening, Judge Brennan found himself near the terrace doors, seeking respite from the crowded ballroom. Through the glass, he observed Sarah speaking with a young black law student who had been working as a server at the event. The judge moved closer, their conversation becoming clearer. "They'll tell you that times have changed," Sarah was saying, her public persona softening into something more genuine. "But when you walk into that courtroom, you're not just representing your client. You're representing every person who looks like you. You'll have to be twice as prepared, twice as professional, twice as patient." The young woman nodded, clutching her serving tray like a shield. "I've heard the stories about certain judges. Listen," Sarah continued, unaware of their observer. "I once had a judge triple a routine traffic fine simply because he didn't like a black attorney challenging his assumptions. But you know what? The next time I saw him, I was managing his family's $50 million estate." A small, satisfied smile crossed her face. "Excellence is the best revenge, but it's exhausting having to prove yourself over and over." Judge Brennan felt each word like a physical blow. He watched as Sarah reached into her evening bag and handed the student her business card. "Call my office on Monday. We have a summer internship program, and I could use someone who understands the value of perseverance." The young woman's eyes widened. "Really? But I'm just a first-year student." "So was I, once," Sarah replied, her voice carrying warmth that Judge Brennan had never heard in his courtroom. "And someone took a chance on me. Sometimes that's all we need. One person who sees past their preconceptions." As the student hurried away, clutching the business card like a precious talisman, Sarah remained on the terrace, her professional mask slipping for just a moment. The weight of constant performance, of never being allowed a single mistake, showed briefly in the slope of her shoulders before she straightened, adjusted her expression, and prepared to return to the gala. Judge Brennan stepped back into the shadows, his own mask of judicial impartiality feeling heavier than ever. The conversation he had witnessed wasn't meant for him, but its impact would prove impossible to ignore. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Judge Brennan's chambers as he awaited Sarah Washington's arrival. He had specifically requested this meeting, choosing his own territory, a decision whose symbolism now struck him as yet another unconscious assertion of power. The familiar surroundings that usually brought him comfort now felt oppressive, laden with the weight of generations of systemic inequality. At precisely 4:00 p.m., Sarah entered, her professional demeanor firmly in place. "Judge Brennan," she acknowledged, taking the offered seat across from his desk. The leather creaked softly as she settled, her portfolio balanced precisely on her lap. "Ms. Washington," he began, his judicial composure wavering slightly, "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me here, rather than at your office." He paused, noting how even this opening statement carried an implicit reminder of their previous power dynamic. "Your chambers seemed appropriate for this conversation," Sarah replied, her tone neutral but her eyes sharp with understanding. "After all, this is where many of your decisions are made." The judge nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "I've been reviewing my court records," he said, gesturing to the stack of files on his desk. "Particularly the morning session when you appeared before me." He drew a deep breath. "My behavior was inexcusable." Sarah remained silent, allowing the moment to stretch. Years of experience had taught her the power of calculated silence, letting others fill the uncomfortable void. "I've spent my career believing I was administering justice equally," he continued, his voice carrying the strain of recent self-reflection. "But when I reviewed the patterns in my rulings, the statistics tell a different story. The disparities in fines, the interruptions during arguments, the dismissive treatment, particularly of minority attorneys." $342, Sarah interjected quietly. "I'm sorry. That's the average difference between fines you've imposed on minority defendants versus white defendants for the same offenses," she stated, drawing a document from her portfolio. "My firm maintains databases of judicial patterns. It's something we have to track, for our clients' sake." Judge Brennan felt the blood drain from his face. "You knew this when you took on my family's case." "I knew this before I ever stepped into your courtroom that morning," Sarah confirmed. "Just like I knew you interrupted female attorneys 42% more frequently than their male counterparts. We all do our homework, Judge Brennan. We have to." The silence that followed felt heavier than any courtroom pronouncement. Through the window, the sounds of the city continued unabated, oblivious to the moment of reckoning taking place within these wood-paneled walls. "I've been wrong," he finally said, the words falling like gavels in the quiet room. "Not just with you, but systematically, persistently wrong. And I'm sorry, though I know that's inadequate given the scope of the impact." Sarah leaned forward slightly. "You're right. It is inadequate, but it's a starting point." She pulled out another document. "I took the liberty of preparing some statistics about your court's impact on our community. Not for the estate planning, for this conversation. Would you like to go through them?" Judge Brennan nodded, reaching for his reading glasses. "Yes," he said quietly. "I believe I need to understand the full extent of the damage." As the evening light faded from his chambers, they went through the numbers together. Each statistic a story, each percentage a person whose life had been affected by unconscious bias turned into conscious harm. It was a different kind of justice being served, measured not in fines or sentences, but in uncomfortable truths and necessary reckonings. 6 months after that pivotal conversation in his chambers, Courtroom 7A had undergone a transformation that went far beyond its physical appearance. Judge Michael Brennan sat at his bench, observing the morning session with new eyes. The wooden panels still gleamed with age-old dignity, but the atmosphere had shifted noticeably. A young black attorney, fresh from passing the bar, stood at the podium presenting her first case. In the past, Judge Brennan might have shown impatience with her methodical presentation. Now he listened attentively as she carefully laid out her arguments, noting how her initial nervousness gave way to growing confidence as she realized she would be heard fairly. The courthouse staff had noticed the changes in Judge Brennan's demeanor. His mandatory bias training program for all courtroom personnel had raised eyebrows initially, but the results spoke for themselves. The quarterly statistics showed a marked improvement in equitable treatment across all demographics. Even the court reporters had commented on the different energy in his courtroom. Sarah Washington's influence extended beyond the Brennan family estate. Her firm now regularly sent junior associates to observe proceedings in courtroom 7A, citing it as an example of judicial best practices. The irony wasn't lost on Judge Brennan. His courtroom had become a model for the very fairness it had once lacked. During a break between cases, he reviewed the morning's docket in his chambers. A framed document hung prominently on the wall beside his father's portrait. The statistical analysis Sarah had presented during their reckoning. It served as a daily reminder of how justice could be unconsciously undermined and the constant vigilance required to maintain true equality under the law. The Brennan family estate planning had been completed with exemplary precision. Sarah's expertise had not only protected their assets, but had also guided them toward establishing a new foundation focused on providing legal education scholarships to minority students. Eleanor Brennan had been particularly pleased with this addition to their legacy. As the afternoon session began, Judge Brennan noticed Sarah entering his courtroom with a client, her first appearance before him since their confrontation. The whispers among the gallery suggested that others remembered their last encounter, but the dynamic had shifted dramatically. Her client, a small business owner facing a complex regulatory issue, received the same measured consideration that had become the new standard in courtroom 7A. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice carrying the same quiet confidence it always had, "we submit that the precedent established in Thompson v. Richardson directly applies to our case." She proceeded with her argument, and Judge Brennan listened with genuine attention, asking pertinent questions that demonstrated his engagement with the legal issues at hand. After court adjourned, Judge Brennan reviewed applications for his newly established judicial mentorship program. The initiative, inspired by his conversations with Sarah, paired experienced judges with minority law students and young attorneys. The stack of applications on his desk represented hope for a justice system that could acknowledge its flaws and actively work to correct them. That evening, as he prepared to leave the courthouse, he passed the young attorney from the morning session discussing her case with a colleague. Her eyes shone with the satisfaction of being truly heard, perhaps for the first time in her budding career. It was a small moment, but it represented everything he had learned about the real meaning of justice, not just in theory, but in practice. The setting sun cast long shadows through the courthouse windows, but unlike 6 months ago, these shadows no longer held the weight of unacknowledged bias. Instead, they marked the passing of an old era and the continuation of a new one, where justice was not just a concept, but a living, evolving practice that required constant attention, reflection, and most importantly, change.